Episode 30. When is rebellion justified? There is something about rebellion that science fiction loves. The Rebel Alliance, the Freedmen, the Resistance, the Maquis, Katniss Everdeen, underground movement, secret cells, occupied worlds, oppressed population finally deciding enough. And in stories, rebellion can look heroic, even inevitable. But there is a harder question underneath all that because not everyone who rebels is automatically right. Not every revolution produces justice. Not every resistance movement remains moral. And sometimes the people fighting oppression become what they once hated. So today I want to ask a question that science fiction has been wrestling with for generations. When is rebellion justified? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Last time we talked about what happens when civilization begin valuing order more than freedom. Systems become obsessed with stability. Surveillance increases. Dissent becomes suspicious. Fear becomes useful. And eventually obedience starts looking like virtue. But those systems eventually create resistance. Someone refuses, someone says no. Someone decides that the cost of obedience has become greater than the cost of resistance. And that is where rebellion began. But rebellion is complicated because from a distance we tend to love rebels, especially successful ones. History often turns rebels into heroes after the struggle is over. But during the struggle, they may be called criminals, traitors, extremists, terrorists, radical, enemies of the state. And science fiction forces us to sit with that uncomfortable reality. Because whether someone looks like a freedom fighter or a dangerous insurgent often depends on where you are standing. So the real question is not simply are they rebelling? The better question are why are they rebelling? What have they endured? What options remain? Who are they willing to hurt? What kind of future are they trying to build? And perhaps most importantly, what moral limits will they refuse to cross? Because rebellion without moral boundaries can become another form of tyranny. Let's begin with Star Wars. The Rebel Alliance is one of science fiction's most famous resistance movement. And what makes their rebellion seemingly morally justified, the Empire is not simply unpopular, it is openly oppressive. Political representation has been stripped away. Entire populations are ruled through fear. Dissent is punished. Military force is used to maintain control. And eventually, peaceful political participation becomes almost meaningless. That matters because rebellion often becomes morally serious when normal mechanism for change has been removed. When people can no longer vote meaningfully, speak safely, organize freely, challenge leadership, or appeal to justice, resistance began to look different. The Rebel Alliance is not fighting because it lost one election. It is fighting because the political system itself has been hollowed out. That gives us one possible principle. Rebellion becomes more justifiable when peaceful reform is no longer realistically available. That does not make every action taken by the rebels automatically right, but it changes the moral landscape. If a system gives people no lawful way to correct injustice, the system itself may be creating the condition for rebellion. And Star Wars repeatedly reminds us that authoritarian power does not merely suppress resistance, it often manufactures it. The tighter the empire squeezes, the more people begin asking whether obedience is still morally acceptable. This becomes even more complicated in Andor. Andor asks a darker question than traditional Star Wars. Not simply how do you fight tyranny, but what does fighting tyranny do to you? The rebellion in Andor is messy. People lie, manipulate, sacrifice, compromise. They make decisions that cost lives. And sometimes they justify moral disturbing choices by saying the cause is bigger than the individual. And that makes us uncomfortable because every revolution is tempted by the same argument. The future will justify what we do today, and that is dangerous. Once you believe the call justifies anything, you can begin excusing almost anything. Cruelty, deception, collateral damage, betrayal, even innocent death. And suddenly the resistance begin using the same logic as the oppressor. The empire says order justifies sacrifice. The rebel may say freedom justifies sacrifice. But for the innocent person being sacrificed, the slogan may not matter very much. That is one of the most mature ideas Andors present. Rebellion may be necessary, but still morally dangerous. Sometimes resistance requires people to make terrible choices. But the moment the rebels stop questioning those choices, something has gone wrong. A righteous cause should not eliminate conscience. If anything, it should demand more of it. Because if your goal is to build a better world, you should care deeply about what kind of people you are becoming while you build it. And that brings us to the Hunger Games. At first, the moral lines appear clear. The capital is oppressive, the districts are exploited. Children are forced into the Hunger Games. Rebellion seems not only understandable, but necessary. But as the story develops, we begin seeing something disturbing. The rebellion itself is capable of becoming cruel. President Coin may oppose President Snow, but opposition to a, a tyrant does not automatically make someone just. That is one of the strongest warnings in the series. Replacing a ruler is not the same thing as replacing the system. And replacing the system is not the same thing as changing the value underneath it. If revenge becomes the foundation of the new order, then the revolution has not truly escaped the old world. It has simply changed who holds power. That is why Katniss becomes so important. Her final moral decision is not simply about defeating Snow, it's about recognizing the possibility that the revolution could reproduce the very cruelty it claimed to oppose. That is a warning worth remembering. Rebellion often begins with legitimate grievances, but once victory becomes possible, a new temptation emerges: punishment, revenge, humiliation, the desire to make the former oppressor suffer. And emotionally, that can feel like justice. But revenge and justice are not the same thing. Think about it. Justice asks, what will restore moral order? And revenge asks, how can we make them hurt the way that we hurt? Those are very different questions. And revolution that cannot tell the difference often become the next tyranny. Star Trek gives us one of the most interesting examples through the Maquis. The Maquis are not fighting a cartoonish evil empire. That makes the issue more complicated. They are settlers who feel abandoned by political agreements made over their heads. They believe institutions that were supposed to protect them has failed, and they chose armed resistance. Some Starfleet officers sympathize with them. Others see them as dangerous. And that ambiguity is the point. Not every rebellion emerges from absolute tyranny. Sometimes resistance emerges from people who believe institutions have made compromises at their expense. And this creates a harder moral problem. When does grievance justify violence? What level of injustice make rebellion acceptable? What if institutions are flawed, but not completely illegitimate? What if reform is difficult but still possible? Those questions matter because resistance can become emotionally intoxicating. Once people become convinced that the system is completely evil, every compromise starts to look like betrayal. Every moderate looks weak. Every negotiation looks corrupt. And the movement can become more extreme over time. Star Trek often reminds us that the moral seriousness requires resisting simple narrative. Sometimes the institution is wrong. Sometimes the rebels are right about the problem, but wrong about the solution. And sometimes both sides have legitimate concerns. That is not satisfying, but reality often is not. Then we come to the film Dune. Dune gives us another powerful warning. Be careful when rebellion becomes central around one person, one hero, one chosen figure, one savior. Paul Atreides become a symbol of resistance, but symbol become dangerous when people stop questioning them. A movement built around personality can quickly become a movement built around obedience. And once that happens, the revolution may reproduce the same structure of power it was trying to destroy. And that is one of the deepest warning in this film. People who desperately want liberation may become vulnerable to charismatic leaders, especially leaders who appear destined, necessary, beyond criticism. That should always make us cautious. A just rebellion should not merely ask who should rule, it should ask who should power itself be restrained. Excuse me, how should power itself be restrained? Because if the only goal is replacing the person at the top, nothing fundamental has changed. The throne remains, the machinery remains, the culture of obedience remains, only the name changes. And that's why revolution must think beyond victory. They must think about limits, institution, accountability, the transfer of power, the protection of dissent. Otherwise, the rebellion can win the war and lose the future. So after all these stories, can we actually answer the question, when is rebellion justified? Well, science fiction gives us several principles. First, the injustice must be serious, not inconvenience, not disappointment, not simply losing a political argument. Rebellion carries enormous consequences. Lives are lost, communities fractured, institutions collapse. Violence creates wounds that can last generations. That means rebellion should never be romanticized. Second, peaceful avenues for change matter. If meaningful reform is still available, resistance should not rush casually toward violence. But when every peaceful path is closed, more responsibility changes. Third, the method matters. A just cause does not make every tactic just. If resistance deliberately becomes cruel, indiscriminate, or even dehumanizing, then it begins undermining the value it claims to defend. Fourth, the future matters. Rebels must ask, what happens the day after victory? Who governs? Who has power? What protects minority? What protects former enemies? What prevents revenge? What stops the new leaders from becoming the old leaders? And finally, rebellion must preserve human dignity. That may be the hardest standard of all because conflict encourages people to stop seeing opponents as human. But once that happens, atrocities become easier. The challenge of moral resistance is not simply defeating evil, It is resisting evil without letting evil reshape you. So maybe that is the central lesson science fiction offers. Rebellion is not the destination, it is a transition. Destroying something is easier than building something better. It can take one battle to overthrow a government. It may take generations to build justice. And that is where science fiction becomes most interesting. Because the real test of a revolution may not be what people do while they are fighting, it may be what they do after they win. Do they restore rights? Do they tolerate disagreements? Do they give up emergency powers? Do they protect the weak? Do they allow former enemies to become citizens again? Do they create institutions stronger than personality? Or do they simply become the next empire? And that may be the uncomfortable truth. The oppressed can become the oppressors. The rebels can become the ruler. The freedom fighter can become the authoritarian. Not because rebellion was always wrong, but because power changes the moral test. It is one thing to fight for freedom. It is another thing to hold power and still allow others to be free. So maybe the most important question is not, would I join the rebellion? Maybe the deeper question is, what kind of person would I become if my side won? Because victory does not automatically create justice. Justice must still be chosen again and again and again. And that takes us directly to the next question. What happens after the revolution? The empire falls, the dictator is gone, the rebels win, everyone celebrates. But then morning comes. Someone has to govern, someone has to rebuild, someone has to decide what justice looked like now. And sometimes that is where the real problem began. So, next on the Sci Fi Griot, episode 31, what happens after the revolution? Because overthrowing an empire may be easier than building something better. Here's my final reflection. It's a question that I want to leave you with. If you were living under an unjust system, how much would have to happen before you believe resistance was morally necessary? And then the harder question, what would you refuse to do, even for a cause you believe was right? This has been the Sci-Fi Griot, a place where science fiction gives us story, and the story gives us questions.